Well, the breakup was inevitable, and I spirited the breakup. I mean, I was really responsible for breaking it up.
The relationship with Dean ends in 1956. The partnership ends in 1956.
10 years to the day.
To the day.
Don't you want me to sing a song?
Oh, yeah, but I thought you and I could do a song together both.
They were Hollywood's golden duo, Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis. Unstoppable, adored, and seemingly untouchable.
Why are you waiting?
I forgot what song we were singing.
But behind the laughs, the charm, and the box office success, one sketch turned everything upside down. A single performance that wasn't just comedy. It was a spark that ignited ego clashes, bitter resentment, and whispers that the partnership was already cracking.
If the tables were turned and I was Dean Martin and Dean was Jerry, we'd have split up maybe 5 years earlier.
Was it really just a sketch gone wrong? Or was it the moment Martin and Lewis began plotting their split? The truth is far more scandalous than fans ever imagined. Martin and Lewis weren't just a comedy duo, they were a storm waiting to happen. Dean Martin, the smooth nightclub singer, and Jerry Lewis, the wild comic lip-syncing to records, first crossed paths in 1944. By the time they officially debuted at Atlantic City's 500 Club on July 25, 1946, sparks were already flying, not just on stage, but behind the curtain. For 10 explosive years, they ruled nightclubs, radio, television, and films. But as their fame grew, so did the cracks. Early on, they were simply Martin and Lewis, but when the branding shifted to their full names, Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis, it wasn't just marketing. Insiders whispered it was the first step in preparing for their inevitable solo careers. And sure enough, when the split finally came, it was less of a surprise and more of a scandal everyone saw coming.
And Frank hadn't really hit yet. I'm talking about 43, 42.
In 1944, Dean Martin crossed paths with a young, unpredictable Jerry Lewis at New York City's Glass Hat Club, both performing their own acts. Their official debut together came 2 years later at Atlantic City's 500 Club on July 25, 1946, though it wasn't exactly a match made in heaven. The story goes that Lewis suggested Martin as a last-minute replacement for the scheduled singer, and what followed was pure chaos. The act bombed at first. Skinny D'Amato, the club owner, reportedly threatened to cancel their contract if they didn't improve, or quickly. Instead of following the script, Martin and Lewis threw it out entirely. Martin sang, Lewis dressed as a bumbling busboy, smashing plates and turning Martin's songs and the club itself into a hilarious disaster. Their slapstick and vaudeville antics somehow worked, and the crowd went wild. Their act thrived on controlled mayhem, Lewis heckling Martin mid-song, Martin chasing Lewis, and the two spiraling into chaotic chases across the stage. Behind the laughter, though, the tension was real, foreshadowing a partnership that, while wildly successful, was teetering on the edge of friction that no audience would ever see. The Martin and Lewis phenomenon wasn't confined to nightclubs. They stormed radio and TV, leaving a trail of laughter and tension in their wake. Their NBC radio series, The Martin and Lewis Show, ran from 1948 to 1953, cementing their growing fame. They made a splash on the first episode of Toast of the Town in June 1948, though some insiders whisper they might have sneaked onto TV earlier via Hourglass, the very first variety show, during the duo's formal pairing.
With them as my bait, I signed the 30-week comedy hour. I was the agent for 30 weeks, but I knew I didn't have enough comedy comedians, so I gave 10 weeks to William Morris.
Television only fueled the drama. On October 3rd and 10th, 1948, Martin and Lewis starred in the first 2 episodes of NBC's Welcome Aboard, a live show so chaotic that only a kinescope survives in UCLA's archives. By April 3rd, 1949, they attempted their own TV adaptation of the radio show, with Bob Hope as guest. The result? A lukewarm reception, with Billboard magazine giving lackluster reviews. Critics weren't impressed, and behind the scenes, Lewis began hiring young comedy writers like Norman Lear and Ed Simmons to tighten their act, an early sign that the duo relied as much on talent off stage as on stage. By 1950, Lear and Simmons were practically running the show behind the curtains. Hollywood came calling in 1949 as Paramount Pictures producer Hal Wallace signed them for My Friend Irma, using the duo as comic relief. But some whispered that while the money and fame were rolling in, the cracks in their partnership were growing just as fast.
Dino, all of this stuff with you, and I don't know what happened with you and Jerry, and nor am I interested. You have a contract that you signed, and you have to complete the contract. You gave your word.
Dean Martin was secretly thrilled to escape New York City, a place that never sat right with him. He had a lifelong discomfort with the city, especially its towering buildings. Claustrophobic and wary of elevators, Martin avoided them whenever possible and refused to climb multiple flights of stairs. Even when his rising fame let him lease a swanky Manhattan high-rise apartment, he deliberately chose one on the 3rd floor. Los Angeles, with its low-rise skyline, felt like freedom. Meanwhile, their agent, Abby Greschler, was quietly orchestrating one of Hollywood's shrewdest deals. Martin and Lewis scored $75,000 for their films with producer Hal Wallace, a fortune in the 1940s, but the contract came with perks that gave the duo unprecedented control. They could co-produce one outside film a year through their own York Productions, starring first in the independently produced At War with the Army, 1950. On top of that, they maintained complete control over club, radio, and TV appearances, along with recording contracts. These ventures weren't just successful. They made Martin and Lewis multimillionaires. They also became regulars on NBC's Colgate Comedy Hour throughout the 1950s. But behind the glitz and money, some insiders whispered that the very control they wielded over every aspect of their careers was quietly fueling friction, setting the stage for cracks that would one day split the iconic duo apart. Their comedy hour shows were more than just entertainment. They were chaos in tuxedos. Musical numbers from their nightclub acts or movies were backed by Dick Stabile's big band, punctuated by slapstick sketches, satires of current films and TV, and Martin and Lewis showing off their individual talents. Martin delivered smooth solo songs while Lewis went wild with pantomimes, physical comedy, or even conducting the orchestra. They frequently ad-libbed, broke character, and shattered the fourth wall, giving the audience the thrill of unpredictability. This early television work catapulted them to nationwide fame.
Let you live.
Oh, boy, thanks.
Oh, boy, you're welcome, but on one condition. You gotta keep your mouth shut, you understand?
Sure.
Martin and Lewis weren't just another film team. They were a phenomenon. Each was talented on their own, but their chemistry, the perception of being inseparable friends on and off stage, elevated their act to legendary status. Lewis later summarized it bluntly. Who were Dean's fans? Men, women, Italians. Who were Jerry's fans? Women, Jews, kids. Who were Martin and Lewis's fans? All of them. You had fans who didn't care if Lewis was acting crazy or Martin was singing. Because if Dean was singing, that was Martin and Lewis. If Jerry was going nuts, that was Martin and Lewis, yet behind the seamless act, whispers persisted. Were they really as tight as they seemed, or was all that friendship just part of the show? The cracks would eventually surface in ways no fan could ignore. In the early 50s, Martin and Lewis weren't just popular, they were untouchable. Life magazine crowned them the hottest and highest paid act in America in 1951, right in the middle of their wildly successful movie tour promoting That's My Boy. The crowds were insane. Fans refused to leave their seats, forcing Martin and Lewis to improvise free shows on fire escapes and out dressing room windows. Shoes, hats, even autographs flew into the hands of delirious fans as the streets of each city jammed with devotees desperate for a glimpse of the duo.
Played the subservient little kid to this big handsome man, and we did 2 hours and 20 minutes the second show. By 2 nights later, there were hundreds of people around the block.
But behind the dazzling success, the grind was brutal. Martin carried the thankless role of straight man, and his singing style hadn't yet evolved into the smooth croon he'd later perfect. Critics fawned over Lewis, praising him as the undeniable star of the team, while acknowledging Martin only as the best possible partner for Jerry. Insiders whispered that, according to the critics, Lewis could have thrived with any sidekick. Martin's brilliance was overshadowed by Jerry's antics. Even Lewis, in his book Dean and Me, admitted Martin's genius, calling him one of the great comic talents of all time. But one can't help wondering if all the public adoration quietly fed the tension, planting seeds of resentment that would eventually fracture the duo. In 1945, 19-year-old Jerry Lewis spotted 27-year-old Dean Martin on a New York street, and something clicked. I see this handsome guy in a camel's hair coat. You could die from how handsome he was, sporting his new nose. We became very friendly. He looked like he needed a friend, and I certainly did. And that was the start. Lewis later recalled. Fate, it seemed, had a hand in bringing them together.
He brought a discipline and an excellence that made what I did that much funnier.
By 1946, the duo was already testing comedy bits on the same bill at NYC's Havana Madrid nightclub. When a singer bailed on a set in Atlantic City, Lewis convinced the club owner to give Martin a shot. That night, they performed their first act together, and it was instant magic. The mix of Martin's smooth, crooning charm and Lewis's chaotic, childlike antics was combustible. Singer Steve Lawrence remembered their Copacabana debut. It was like an explosion. You would not believe the pandemonium that existed in that club. It just went nuts. They broke every record in the house. From the very beginning, Martin and Lewis weren't just entertainers. They were a phenomenon, destined to mesmerize audiences while secretly planting the seeds of tension that fame would later magnify. Martin and Lewis didn't just make people laugh, they made audiences swoon. Their act brought a kind of SX appeal to comedy that no one had ever seen before. This was the first time there was a comedy act that looked like this, Steve Lawrence said. They were very attractive-looking guys. Before that, you had duos like Laurel and Hardy, Abbott and Costello, Olsen and Johnson. Then Martin and Lewis came along, and they were just so different. The numbers were staggering. Lewis later recalled, "We went from $500 a week in Atlantic City to $4 million a year in 1947 to 1948. Before their fateful pairing in 1946, both men had been struggling. Martin, the son of Italian immigrants, had worked as a foundry hand, booze salesman, and boxer, anything to get by while chasing a singing career. Lewis was performing lip-sync nightclub acts, and in his own words, "If I didn't have my partner, I'd probably still be in the Borscht Belt doing pantomime." Hollywood came calling almost immediately. Over the next decade, the duo made 16 films together, usually following the same formula. Two unlikely friends torn apart by chaos, often women chasing Martin's character, only to ultimately have each other's backs. The films were a hit, but behind the cameras, their personalities clashed. Martin admitted, "I'm shy. If I walk into a party, I sort of go into a corner because I don't know what to say to people." Meanwhile, Lewis thrived on attention and chaos, creating a dynamic that was electrifying on stage but volatile off it.
Jerry Lewis, he was using recorded music, and Jerry was backstage messing with that. Loused him off.
Even as their fame skyrocketed, the contrast between Martin's cool, reserved charm and Lewis's manic energy hinted at cracks in the partnership that few audiences would ever suspect. Lewis once bragged about their wildly different lifestyles. Dean was considered the ladies' man, but he was watching westerns in his suite. "I was busy making relationships, 3 or 4 women a day. God almighty, I was like a kid in a candy store." Behind the polished smiles on stage, their personal lives couldn't have been more different, fueling quiet jealousy and competition that few fans ever imagined.
He took that kind of treatment for 10 years. Jerry this, Jerry's the guy, Jerry's this, the silly kid, Jerry's the business.
Yet despite their wildly contrasting personalities, Martin and Lewis formed a bond almost like siblings. "Jerry was my dad's best man when he married Jean," recalled Dean Martin. Dean went on to marry 3 times and father 8 children, while Lewis had 2 marriages and 7 kids. "We would go over to Jerry's house for Christmas, even though they were Jewish," Dina added. Dad and Jerry truly loved each other, but behind the scenes, the truth was messier. SX, egos, and clashing lifestyles simmered beneath the surface of that magical decade. Even in the most glamorous years of fame, the duo's bond was as complicated as it was legendary, a love-hate dynamic that made the magic on stage almost too explosive to last. But the glittering facade of Martin and Lewis was starting to crack. Dina Martin sensed a shift behind the scenes. Jerry was increasingly taking control of their act, and talk of going solo began to surface.
I broke it up. I was the heavy. And I wanted to break it up because I loved him too much.
For Jerry, who still idolized Dean, it felt like a gut punch. Shock and betrayal simmered beneath the surface, and before long, the tension became unbearable. They stopped speaking altogether. Later, Jerry revealed just how toxic the outside influence had been. Someone said to Dean, "You don't need him. Why don't you just sing and do films yourself?" And I was getting poisoned as well. What do you need him for? I hated him for allowing the split to happen. He hated me for allowing the split to happen. The cracks weren't just personal. They were stoked by whispers, jealousy, and backdoor manipulations. The duo that once seemed inseparable was now at war, a shocking fall from the pedestal that fans had so adored. Dean and Jerry called it quits after one final performance at Manhattan's Copacabana on July 24, 1956. The next morning, Jerry confessed he understood how an amputee must feel, completely hysterical over the split, while Dean played it cool as a cucumber. The two didn't speak for a staggering 20 years. It took the only man powerful enough to bridge that chasm, Frank Sinatra, to bring them together. Jerry Lewis hated surprises, and on September 5, 1976, the biggest shock of his then more than 30-year career was about to unfold at Las Vegas's Sahara Hotel. His annual MDA Telethon, already a high-profile event, turned into a Hollywood-style, very special episode when Frank Sinatra showed up to perform live, the first time he'd done so in over 2 decades.
How'd that happen?
That was Frank. Frank took care of that.
Sinatra.
Yeah. He thought it was about time we stopped this nonsense.
After his set, Sinatra handed Jerry a few donations, including one for $5,000 on behalf of his grandchildren. Then he dropped the bomb. "Listen," he said, "I have a friend who loves what you do every year and who just wanted to come out. Could you send my friend out, please?" Meanwhile, across the country in New York, Dean Martin's 6-year-old grandson heard his mother scream. "What's the matter, Mom?" he asked. Pointing at the TV, she said, "It's your grandfather." What followed was a reunion nobody thought would happen. Two legendary stars, once torn apart by ego, jealousy, and decades of silence, suddenly face to face. Behind the smiles and applause, however, insiders whispered that old tensions simmered beneath the surface. Could these two giants of comedy truly reconcile after years of rivalry, or was it a staged spectacle for the cameras?
I introduced Frank, brought him on. Sweet. He read a beautiful letter from one of his grandchildren. I loved that.
Dean and Martin had been watching the telethon, a family ritual that endured even after the infamous breakup of America's most successful comedy team, Martin and Lewis, 2 decades earlier. When Uncle Frank's mysterious friend first emerged from the shadows, Deanna couldn't see his face. "I knew his walk," she told Vanity Fair in a phone interview. "I got chills. My jaw dropped. I called my sister. She said, 'I can't believe this.'" And there they were, Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis, reunited, embracing and joking on stage for the first time in 20 years, as if no time had passed. Sinatra, mic in hand, couldn't hide his excitement. "Here they are, folks," he said, his arm draped over Jerry's shoulder. The standing ovation lasted more than a minute.
"Will you send my friend out here?" And out walks Dean. And I just looked up to heaven and said, "Dear God, give me something to say."
Vegas, it seemed, had turned history into spectacle. In John Ford's The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, a newspaperman explains to Jimmy Stewart, "This is the West, sir. When the legend becomes fact, print the legend." In this case, the legend had walked onto the stage, and the cameras and the world couldn't get enough. Behind the smiles, however, the whispers persisted. After decades of rivalry, old egos didn't simply vanish. Was this reunion pure joy, or just another carefully staged spectacle? Martin, the smooth crooner, and Lewis, the frantic tumbler, first teamed up in 1946. According to Lewis's memoir, Dean and Me, a love story when they met, the brash 19-year-old Lewis, 9 years Martin's junior, boldly asked his future partner, "You workin'?" What followed was a phenomenal 10-year run. They dominated radio, television, nightclubs, and movies, but beneath the glittering success, an insurmountable rift was quietly growing. On July 24, 1956, exactly 10 years to the day after their first appearance, they performed their final nightclub act at New York's famed Copacabana, the hottest spot in town. Fast forward to 1976, and Dean's surprise appearance at Jerry's telethon blindsided Lewis. "You son of a bitch," he muttered sotto voce to Frank Sinatra, before joking, "Should have been a Jew that did it." Then Sinatra stepped aside, leaving Jerry alone with Dean. "So, how you been?" Jerry began. "You know, it seems like we haven't seen each other for 20 years, Martin replied. Jerry shot back. "Well, you know, there were all those rumors about our breaking up, and then when I started the show and you weren't here, I believed it." Gary Lewis, Jerry's son and frontman of the 1960s hitmakers Gary Lewis and the Playboys later recalled asking his father what was going through his mind at that moment. "He told me his mind was going a million miles an hour," Gary said. "Jerry was thinking, how am I going to handle this? Am I going to joke with him? Am I going to talk normal?" The years of rivalry, ego, and silence collided in a single electric moment on stage, leaving the world, and even the performers themselves, breathless. What Jerry ultimately came up with was a perfect in-joke, a nod to the very moment that started it all. To his former partner, he asked with a sly grin, "So, you workin'?"
And I looked at him, I said, "You working?" So it was a good start.
They loved each other, Dina Martin said. "There was something amazing about Dad. He was nice and sweet and kind to everyone, and he would let things go. But when he had it up to here, he'd had it up to here. There was no fight or yelling. He would just be done." But it took Frank Sinatra, the only man with enough clout and cunning, to orchestrate the long-awaited reconciliation. He's the only person who could have achieved something like that, Jerry's manager Mark Rosano later explained. "The Sinatra and Martin families were completely in the dark. I was as surprised as everybody else," Nancy Sinatra said. "My dad really knew how to keep a secret." Dina, who had performed on the telethon herself, later learned from co-host Ed McMahon that Sinatra had secretly staged Dean's entrance, hiding him in McMahon's dressing room. She imagined it like a scene from Goodfellas, Henry Hill style, sneaking into the Copa through the kitchen. "I'm sure Dad was in his tuxedo. They picked him up, took him up through the back way, underneath, through parking lots. All those exciting, not so glamorous ways to get into a showroom. Even in their reunion, the drama, secrecy, and behind-the-scenes maneuvering were as much a part of the story as the laughter and hugs. Proof that the legend of Martin and Lewis was never just about comedy."
You still thought of him as your best friend?
Oh, God, yes. Oh, yes. He was the nicest, warmest, most genuine, honorable, integral man I'd ever known in my life.
Adding to the drama, Gary, then 30 and completely unaware of the looming reunion, had been at the telethon that night running errands for his father, fetching sodas, delivering production papers. On one such errand, he noticed a dressing room door slightly ajar and caught sight of Dean. "I thought, what the hell is going on? But I didn't say a word to my dad, just to be safe," he later admitted. He always said he hated surprises, so I wasn't about to be the one to ruin this one. Why did Frank do it? Director Peter Bogdanovich had been in Vegas that night, an invited guest alongside Sybil Shepherd of Sinatra at Caesar's Palace. Bogdanovich, who had profiled Lewis in 1962 for Esquire, recalled being amazed and moved by the reunion, which he and Shepherd watched on television from their hotel suite. "After Frank's show at Caesar's, I told him, that was quite a moment," Bogdanovich said. He replied the same thing he'd said on air, that he thought it was about time. Anything beyond that, however, veered into speculation. According to James Kaplan, author of Frank, the Chairman, the second volume of Sinatra's definitive biography, who had also collaborated with Lewis on Dean and Me, Kaplan noted, "Frank was singing live on that telethon for the first time in 23 years. It was a big deal, and I think he wanted his old friend there for support. But Frank also had a prankish, almost mischievous streak. I suspect he thought it would be hilarious," Kaplan added. "When he proposed it to Dean, Dean probably just thought, what the the purest expression of his menefregismo, his don't-give-a-damn personality, and his version of an enthusiastic yes." The Martin and Lewis reunion exploded across international headlines. But to keep the plan a secret, the building went into near lockdown, manned by Lewis staffers and Sinatra-recruited crew, ready to enforce the big reveal. Meanwhile, Billy Davis Jr. and Marilyn McCoo, founding members of the Fifth Dimension, performed that night at the telethon in between their shows at the Riviera Hotel, entirely unaware they were witnessing one of showbiz's most explosive moments unfold behind the scenes. "They started herding everybody backstage into this room," McCoo recalled in a phone interview. "All we had to do was step outside and get into our car, and we'd be gone. But they didn't want the Dean surprise leaking out," Davis added, his tone hinting at just how tightly controlled the moment had been. Concerns about making it back to the Riviera in time for their second show were eased by their understanding of just how historic this moment was, Davis said. "We wanted to see Jerry Lewis's face when Dean came out," he explained. "We were all glued to the monitors in the room. Everybody clapped like crazy. As soon as Dean walked out on stage, we were finally free to go," McCoo added, a smile in her voice. In 1991, the couple would perform with the Fifth Dimension for the first time in 17 years. "So these reunions do happen," McCoo laughed. "I love Dean," Gary recalled. "I met him when I was 3. He was always Uncle Dean. always smooth, always cool. That wasn't put on at all. I reintroduced myself that night in case he didn't recognize me, because it was the 70s, I had long hair, and I was wearing weird clothes. I said, "I'm Gary." He said, "I know," and he called me Pally. That, of course, was Dean's signature term of endearment. Dina recalled asking her father about that night. His response? "It was okay. That's just the way my dad was," she said. He downplayed everything. He never wanted to make a big deal out of anything. We were just thrilled because we'd always loved Dean and Jerry together. I had kept in touch with Jerry and with Gary. We'd done a show together at Caesars in 1968 called Chips Off the Old Block. I don't know if they were talking all the time, but when my brother Dean Paul passed away, Jerry showed up at the funeral. He didn't say anything. He stayed in the back. It was very respectful. Dean Paul's death, in a way, forced a measure of reconciliation. Jerry even talked about the fantasy of playing golf together hanging out, Kaplan said, but it wasn't meant to be. They were show business giants, separate suns in separate solar systems. Neither was willing to yield enough to be vulnerable to say, "Let's really be friends." Show business friendships are strange like that. Still, Jerry managed a small, memorable gesture. He surprised Dean at his 72nd birthday with a cake. "Why we broke up, I'll never know," Dean proclaimed, a statement that hung in the air like a silent accusation, hinting at old wounds that fame and ego had never fully healed.
To forget that he sang and mention only the crazy stuff they did together, that's terrible.
It might not have ended there. In the early 1980s, Peter Bogdanovich came up with the audacious idea of reuniting Dean and Jerry on the big screen, alongside Frank Sinatra, James Stewart, Lee Marvin, and Charles Aznavour. Naturally, it would be a Vegas story, with the ensemble portraying degenerate gamblers. Dean's and Jerry's characters wouldn't speak to each other until the final scene, when they would share a simple, knowing smile. Frank, Bogdanovich said, was the first to sign on. He offered to recruit Dean and directed Bogdanovich to call Jerry. "Frank called me and said Dean was in," Bogdanovich recalled. He asked Dean if he would mind working with Jerry. Sinatra quoted him as saying, "Oh." Then came Jerry. He wanted Frank's blessing before committing. "He called me back and said, 'I guess you're right,'" Bogdanovich said. He joked, "I hope this works out, and if it doesn't, I'll be just as happy to see you fall on your face." It didn't work out. The project collapsed in the deal stage, and Dean passed away in 1995 at the age of 78, leaving Hollywood to wonder what might have been. 40 years after that legendary telethon reunion, the artists interviewed for this story were still active. Gary was touring most weekends, singing hits like "This Diamond Ring" and "Everybody Loves a Clown." Dina released a new CD, Swing Street, and was preparing a centennial celebration of her father's birthday in 2017. Billy and Marilyn were touring with Up, Up and Away, a musical fable, a career retrospective and musical portrait of the 1960s. Bogdanovich's She's Funny That Way had premiered in 2014, and Jerry, who had turned 90 in March, had a new film, Max Rose, scheduled for September, his first since Funny Bones in 1995. He toured with his one-man show, and clips of the iconic reunion remained a high point. "It's something fans want to see with him in the room," said Rosano. "It's one of the most iconic moments in television history. But rest assured, there would be no more surprises while Jerry was on stage, though that didn't stop plenty of people from trying. Various celebrities kept approaching me, wanting to jump out during the show or even reunite him with someone he'd worked with," Rosano recalled. "And I was forever saying, 'Good Lord, no. Absolutely not.'" He paused, exhaling with a mix of amusement and exasperation. "They all want to be Frank Sinatra." At Jerry's 1976 Muscular Dystrophy Association telethon, the world saw what looked like a warm reunion. Dean strode on stage, and the old friends embraced. But behind the smiles and camera flashes, Jerry made one thing crystal clear. An official reunion, any kind of return to the glory days, was never going to happen. "I don't think it's in the cards," he told the press. "Our lifestyles and careers are separate and apart." That wasn't just a polite refusal. It was a dagger to Hollywood rumor mills that had been whispering about a comeback for years. Yet their bond, twisted, fiery, and deeply personal, was quietly cemented through tragedy. In 1987, Dean's son, Dean Paul Martin Jr., died in a devastating plane crash at just 35. Jerry showed up to the funeral, but not as the star the world knew. He sat silently in the back, avoiding attention, reason, avoiding cameras, avoiding Dean himself. Afterwards, Jerry called Dad and said, "I didn't want to make it about me or us. It was about Dino," Dina Martin recalled. "They talked for an hour, and it meant so much to my dad. Some would call it loyalty. Others might call it obsession, the kind only decades of complicated friendship could forge." Jerry himself later recalled the raw depth of Dean's grief. "He sobbed for the first time I'd ever heard. He said, 'Don't you understand? I just lost one of the only two male loves I had in my life, him and you.' That was the first time he had ever admitted, or even hinted, that he loved me. Love, not just friendship, not just respect, but something far more intimate and unspoken, buried beneath a decade of power struggles, ego clashes, and relentless public scrutiny."
I lost my partner and best friend, the man who made me the man I am today. I think of him with undying respect. That's quite something to say about a guy who you didn't really see much after 1956.
The controversy? Hollywood insiders have long speculated that the tension between Dean and Jerry and his unwillingness to share the spotlight pushed Dean to the brink of resentment. Dean, the smooth crooner adored by millions, reportedly felt overshadowed and even betrayed by the man he called his closest friend. Behind closed doors, fights erupted over creative control, money, and recognition, and some say Jerry's need for adoration drove a wedge between them that the world could never see. Still, even after decades of rivalry, public silence, and private battles, the truth was undeniable. Dean and Jerry's connection went far beyond comedy. It was combustible, messy, and unforgettable, a love-hate relationship that defined the golden era of Hollywood. After that fragile reconciliation, Dean and Jerry stayed in touch, their bond surviving the storms that had once threatened to destroy it, until Dean's death from lung cancer at 78 on Christmas Day, 1995. Jerry lived on, quietly, passing away years later on August 20th, 2017, at the age of 91. "They made history as the greatest comedy team ever," Dina Martin said. "They made people laugh, feel good, and through all the fights, betrayals, and egos, they truly loved each other. Even with the scandals, the bitter years apart, and whispers of hidden tensions and jealousy, their story wasn't just about comedy. It was about a bond so powerful, so contradictory, that it survived fame, fortune, heartbreak, and Hollywood's relentless glare. A bond that, in its own way, remains one of the most controversial, misunderstood, and hauntingly beautiful friendships in entertainment history." That's it for today. See you in the next video. Until then, goodbye.